Hello there, everybody. It's lovely to meet you all and to have met some of you, most of you in the last day or so. It's a great pleasure to be here in Kilmore Quay. Normally when I give talks like this, it's to a room full of indifferent undergraduate students, so thank you all for volunteering to be here. And thank you to everyone at Right by the Sea for hosting me, for inviting me in the first place, and for feeding me while I've been here. I think I've eaten twice my body weight in the local seafood already, and I'm only just getting started. So instead of the standard Q&A style conversation, the festival actually thought it would be a good idea if I prepared a butterfly for you all and do some live magic. End of talk. Okay, well, thank you for coming. If I prepared a talk about my approach to novel writing and the research process which underpins it, and this is really good news for me, I think, because I tend to be a lot more interesting on paper than when I try and freestyle clever answers at a moment's notice. But I guess you'll be the judge of that. Apologies in advance if this gets a bit too solipsistic for your taste, but anyway, I'll be talking about myself and writing a little bit with some inserted readings from the book. So I'll be speaking mostly in relation to my fourth novel, The Young Accomplice, which was published in this handsome paperback edition by Penguin in the spring. If you've read it in advance, then you've just realized this is doing this. Excuse me a moment. Oh, that's better. You know what? If you don't mind the striptease. I once invited Tom Stoppard to give a reading to students at a university where I worked, and he started to do this, and he said, he'd just come straight from an event. He said, I hope you don't mind if I take off my... And then he kept going, and he was basically down to his vest and underpants by the time, because he was so hot in the room, and we wondered where he was going to stop. I won't be doing that, but anyway. Yes, if you've read this book in advance, then you've just become my very favourite people. If not, don't worry, because I'm going to be summarising it for you in about 3 seconds. And I'm going to be reading some passages from it as we go to persuade you all into buying it. So The Young Accomplice is the story of two siblings, Joyce and Charlie Savagear, who leave Borstal in the 1950s, which some of you will know, particularly if you've read Brendan Behan's Borstal Boy, was a kind of young offenders institution in the old days. So they leave Borstal in the early 1950s to become apprentices at an architecture practice in Surrey. And this practice is being run by a married couple called the Mayhoods, who've set out to establish their own version of Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin Fellowship Foundation in Wisconsin. And they're perhaps a little idealistic in their approach to the task, but their intentions are good and honest. And that's because Arthur Mayhood himself is a product of the Borstal system. He's raised himself out of poverty in 1930s Liverpool to become a respected architect. And after the war, he's become kind of jaded with his regular practice. He's found some inspiration in the idea of helping young offenders, affording them the same opportunities that he once received himself. But this is just the sort of open-heartedness that people tend to take advantage of in life, at least in my version of it anyway. So things don't quite end up as the Mayhoods have designed them. Now, at the beginning of this book, I'd say I only had two clear objectives in my mind. One was a technical authorial challenge I set myself, which was to write a multiple viewpoint story in the third person, which I hadn't really done before. The other was to write, for a change, about the goodness in people. And since I've been in Kilmore Quay, I've seen there is a lot of goodness in people. But I'd spent a lot of time, particularly with that book there, Station on the Path to Somewhere Better, which was my third novel, a lot of time examining the darker traits of humanity. And I was still recovering from the associated traumas of that experience, which writing that had brought to the surface. So I was ready to write something much more cheerful, maybe just more hopeful, and maybe just more replete with jokes. But I also knew that any book without some pervading sense of doom was unlikely to sustain my interest when I was working on it. I'm the kind of writer who doesn't like to dwell too much in the peacetime of a story. Cheerful picnics, romantic walks along the promenade, laughter with friends in the pub, the general happiness of being alive. These are things I enjoy and desire in reality, of course, but they're things that I ache to disrupt, to threaten, and if possible, to bring to ruin in a work of fiction. It's just the way that my storytelling brain is wired, and it was interesting to hear Orla, if you were here for the reading last night, talking in similar terms. So if you commission me to write an episode of The Flintstones, Barney Rubble would likely end up discovered face down in a tar pit at some point with Wilma's necklace in his pocket and Fred's tooth marks in his arm. If I've learned anything about myself over the years, it's that I like to write about the low stakes moments that precede a tragedy and about characters who create them and are left to recover in their aftermath. I tend to be drawn to close-knit groups of people whose relationships are on the cusp of peril. I like to cast light on the smallest details of daily life or somebody's working practice that are often overlooked, but which are meaningful to the bigger actions of the characters. I'm drawn towards stories with a strong sense of atmosphere from the beginning, and I can't really get a novel going without I have some grasp of its prevailing tone. And this means that there has to be an equilibrium in which some unnamed thing is about to be disturbed. And the manner of expression in the prose is where I feel that's best conveyed. So goodness, happiness, joy, love, peace and understanding, these are the equilibria that we all desire in real life, aren't they? But they're usually fleeting passages of time. They're always in jeopardy of changing. And I think that vulnerability is what I find compelling as an author. So I'm going to give you an example from the first chapter of The Young Accomplice, which I hope will give you some idea of what I mean by this. This is the final point of equilibrium for the characters in the novel. And I'm going to splice this into two pieces because it's quite a long opening chapter. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to give you the first bit and then the end bit. And it's written from the perspective of one of the main characters in the book, Arthur Mayhood. I'll just have a sip of water, which is sort of customary, isn't it? June 1952. The old man had been treading couch grass in the field since dawn, halting now and then to hack a nettle stalk with his dull scythe. Sometimes he'd inspect the heads of flowering weeds and peer back, agonized towards the house, as though he'd sighted a pernicious species long presumed extinct. Arthur Mayhood watched him from the steps of his back porch. It was the sort of clear, bright morning that made him recognize how close he was to happiness, a wholesome sunlight over Ockham that seemed as thick as tallow, and the verdancy of every acre in his view like something rendered for a postcard. If he looked far enough into the distance, he could forget the dire state of his farm and feel good about himself again, remember what it was that had brought him out here in the first place. There was so much to do at Leventree that he'd not anticipated. It had been less than a year, all told, and the house was in good order, but trying to restore the land had broken him, one fruitless day after another. A stubborn part of him used to believe he was invulnerable to the drudge of manual labour. For as long as he still had the use of one good arm, he could manage twice the work of anyone. Well, that streak in him was gone now too. Lately, he'd resolved to take whatever crumb of help or wisdom anyone could throw at him. The old man was a case in point. His name was Hollis, and he'd shown up in the yard at 6 a.m. as promised, wearing a large straw sun hat on a string across his back. A glower had set upon his face, as he'd considered the condition of the fields a moment, but his feelings had remained unspoken. In the dawn light, he'd seemed thinner than he had the day before, his complexion rough as grout. He said he wouldn't mind a cup of tea himself before they made a start on things, seeing as he'd got one on the go already. So they'd stepped into the kitchen, eyeing one another for as long as it had taken to drink up. There'd been some discussion of the lovely weather they'd been having, but the topic had run dry. Hollis had glanced up towards the ceiling. "Mrs. Maywood a late riser, is she?" "Not usually," Arthur had replied. "Thought I'd say hello while I was here." "She's gone to town to fetch your part. How loud's your voice?" The old man had snickered. "Saw your tractor out there in the garage. If it were a horse, I'd shoot it. Wish I had the luxury. What's the part she's after?" "Damned if I know." "Just a leatherhead she's gone?" "Yes. Could have put it in the post for you." "I think she wants to barter down the price." "Well, good for her." This had been as much of an exchange as could be wrung from the old man. There was a dourness to him that seemed reflexive, born of wretched luck in days gone by. Civility and candour were the best assurances for men like Hollis. It had been the same with lads in Borstal and a fair few of the sergeants in his company, while others favoured toadying and politicking. In Arthur's view, a bit of gruffness in a fellow was a sign he wanted to be taken seriously. As they'd gone out to the yard together, he suggested that the windbreak was the place to start. "I think it might be causing us more problems than it's helping." The old man had nodded. "If you say so." They'd moved off together, heading for the bank of ash trees at the far side of the meadow, but then Hollis had stopped walking. "There are two ways we can go about this. Either I can tell you what you want to hear, or I can tell you what I really think. Which one suits you best?" "The truth is all I need for now. And stay put here. I'll have a wander on my own." There was a time, barely a week ago, when Arthur might have been embarrassed to expose the dearth of progress he had made at Leventry. He didn't like to advertise his limitations, even if he could admit to them. But replenishing the grounds of this old place, just making the land functional again, was going to take more than his reserves of industry and patience. It required native wisdom. Men like Hollis had a vast resource of local knowledge and experience to draw from, inherited from their fathers and grandfathers. It was in their bones and blood. They could gauge the character of a soil by sight and feel, but Arthur had no instinct for this type of work. He'd learned the rudiments from books and tried to put the complicated business into practice. He'd scrutinized the survey map 100 times, inserted augers to determine depth, variety, but ask him the condition of his soil today, the very thing upon which Leventry relied, and he couldn't give an answer. Florence always said he ought to be more tolerant of his failings and celebrate his talents. "You're a farmer." "You're not a farmer, you're an architect. There's not a man round here who knows the right end of a T-square, let alone could run a farm and keep a practice going all at once. You're too hard on yourself." Still, he couldn't help suspecting there were people back in London who were taking a dim view of him already. Another city exile with delusions he could work the land. The countryside was teeming with them. So I'm going to cut there, skip past the little flashback which intervenes, in which Arthur first meets Mr. Hollis at the local pub and finally recruits him to help solve the weed problem he's facing on his farm. And at the point we next join them, Hollis is actually walking away from Leventry. He's kind of outraged at the idea that the Mayhoods aren't looking to sell any of the crops that they're going to grow in the place. He says he doesn't want to put his back out for a hobby. So Arthur's now trying to convince him to stick around and help. At the pace the old man was walking off, his hat was dragging on its string, biting his throat. It was only when his lighter and tobacco pouch slipped out of his back pocket that he stopped at all, noticing the clatter on the gravel. He picked up his belongings with a flash of his long arm, then stood up saying, "Let me tell you something, Mr. Maywood. You best consider what you plan to do with all this space, because there's too much here for you to manage on your own and not enough for you to take for granted." He dusted off the pouch, blew on his lighter and inspected it for scratches. You seem a decent bloke to me, and I mean that, but you can't go about the job of farming like you go about the job of being an architect. The ground will eat you up. I understand that. No, see, I don't think you do. Not yet. Arthur grinned at him. Farm supervisor. Excuse me? That's what your title's going to be. And we're going to discuss a proper wage for you as soon as I get payment from a few things I've been doing. Hollis crossed his arms. You've a peculiar way of going about things, you know that? So I've heard. He didn't know what sort of explanation would be satisfactory. There was a sudden coolness to the old man's attitude that was approaching disapproval. A bit of forthrightness was called for now. You've got to understand, we've risked an awful lot to move our practice here. And that's what this place is, a practice, not a farm. We're trying to make a little Taliesin here in Ockham, which I don't expect will mean that much to you, but it's everything to us. This farm, sustaining it, that's central to our cause. We need our land to function just as well as what goes on inside the drafting room. And there isn't much that I don't know about designing buildings, but when it comes to farming, well, you've seen, you know, I'm struggling to cope. An early heat was settling around them. He felt the perspiration at his temples. It was going to be another glorious June day. You're not as hopeless as a few I've seen, the old man said. You got the guts for it, I'll give you that. He heaved out a sigh, slipped the old Hoban into his back pocket, tucked the lighter in his front. Farm supervisor, eh? Job's yours if you want it. It was then, as Hollis was deliberating on his offer in the shadows of the elms, that he caught sight of someone coming up the track from the direction of the road and said, You know this fella? Who? Hollis jabbed a thumb into the distance. He's left your gate wide open. The figure coming up the track was heavy-set and bearded. One side of his shirt was hanging free, leaving a swatch of pale flab exposed above the beltline. There was a composure to the way he walked, with both hands tucked behind his back, but his shoulders had a forward lean that gave him a mean air, a look of shiftlessness, qualities Arthur didn't want around him or his farm. He's probably just asking after work. There's been a load of people coming by of late. I'll tell him to move on. Won't take a minute. If he's short of money, Hollis said, his belly's yet to hear of it. Well, let's give him a chance. Arthur shielded his eyes, called along the track, Hello there, fella, can I help you? The man didn't respond until he'd taken 10 or 12 more strides towards them. There was a sweaty shine about his forehead, a blotchy dampness to his shirt around the armpits. I was passing by, the stranger said, and I got to wondering about your place, that's all. His accent wasn't local, and his tone was slightly hostile. What is it that you do here? I can't tell. Farming, Arthur told him. We're not hiding at the moment, if that's what you're after. Hollis cleared his throat. The stranger stood there, scratching at the little continent of hair remaining at the centre of his scalp. Well, I suppose that's that then, he said. Pardon the intrusion. It's no trouble. Close the gate on your way out, please. The man's face tensed with something like antipathy. It was open when I got here, he said, but I'll shut it. You can watch me and make sure. He slung a heavy look at them and turned on his heels. They let him traipse away along the gravel. You meet all sorts in this game, Hollis said. A lot of them are kind and decent, and the rest are more like him. The stranger reached the gate and, with a sham dispassion, pulled it closed. He was gone at last, but Arthur could still see his mammoth boot prints in the dirt. There was a chill about the air now in the shaded driveway, and he was thirsting for another cup of tea. He couldn't keep from staring down the track, recalling how the stranger's shape had passed along it like a tram he'd missed. And if it hadn't been for Hollis slapping a big hand upon his shoulder saying, I'd better take you up on it, your offer, seeing as beggars can't be choosers, he might have stayed there until dusk. First things first, I recommend we plough that field as soon as we dug out those weeds, the old man barreled on, then sow it with a cover crop. Rye would be the best bet. Plough that when it comes through, though. Harrow it, sow rapeseed next, turn that under too, and after, they began to walk back to the house again instinctively. No pledges made, no contract, just a mutual direction. Okay, that's that bit. Thank you. So I wanted that stranger character who supposedly wanders onto the farm to be a somewhat innocuous character in the first chapter. I wanted the reader to feel that his presence is kind of ominous, but at the same time it would be relatively quickly forgotten as the novel moves on into other viewpoints and other territory. And I hope that the other viewpoints would then go on to expose him as something more vital to the story. Because his character is in fact the stitch of malevolence that runs through the whole book. It connects the Mayhoods to the Savigears. It undermines all of their best intentions. And he entangles the past of the book with its present. Now, you'll have to permit me to get a little technical for the next few minutes. I've taught creative writing for a long time, perhaps too long. And one of my best received classes, or maybe it's just the one that I enjoy delivering the most, is on the third person point of view and its various guises. And at some point a few years ago, it struck me that I'd been preaching on and on and on to students about third person limited point of view, how to control it, what it can offer a novelist, about great examples of it like Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road, The Big Rock Candy Mountain by Wallace Stegner, The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. But I'd only ever written one novel myself using that technique, and I was still in my 20s when I finished it, so I made a decision in 2019, I remember it well, when I was close to 40, that I would write my next novel in third person and it would incorporate multiple perspectives. And I made that decision and I didn't allow myself to deviate from it because I'm just that ridiculous and stubborn. And anyway, this turned out to be both a helpful pact to make with myself as I was writing, and for reasons I'll get onto later, an incredibly stupid one. So what writing a novel with shifting viewpoints allows an author to do, which a single viewpoint can't quite get across, is to create blind spots in a narrative. So with more lenses to frame events through, there can be a clearer sense of disparity between what some of the characters know and what others don't. One character's agenda can be made to clash or to harmonize with another character's agenda without either of them being aware of it at any given moment. And sometimes if you're crafty enough, you can also withhold or deliver information so that the reader knows more about the character's situations than they do themselves. And all of this has the advantage of generating mystery, suspense, or surprise, even in the less dynamic or overtly interesting moments of the book. And I'm not saying that I achieved any of this masterfully in The Young Accomplice, of course. By no means am I campaigning for my own qualities as a writer, believe me. But I'm telling you that these were my honest intentions at the beginning of writing it. I wanted to achieve something that I'd read and really admired in other writers' novels, and that was all. And oddly, by setting myself this technical challenge, I found that my main thematic idea of goodness began to change as I was writing it as a consequence, because what goodness meant to Joyce Savigear was not the same as what it meant to her brother Charlie, or to Arthur and Florence Mayhood, or to Mr. Hollis. Goodness became a much more opaque virtue in my mind than it appeared when I set out. I found that some characters were suspicious of it, some felt they weren't deserving of it, some didn't believe it existed at all, for some it was innate, for some it was achieved through habit, and others didn't ever recognize it when they had it. And so one chapter at a time, The Young Accomplice became a story of the corruption of goodness more than a depiction of goodness itself. But the problem with writing from multiple perspectives is that an author has a duty to present each of these characters in their fullness. So each character has to be distinct and possessed of a cogent backstory that has brought them to the point the reader finds them at the start of the book. That's why most multiple perspective novels are as thick as railway sleepers. Each character has to have its own narrative timeline with a comprehensive or comprehensible beginning, middle, and end, or else it won't hang together particularly well. And the few readers it attracts will be very quick to point out its failings to you on Amazon and the comments section of The Guardian. Through experience. So achieving this level of fullness I knew would take a lot of research. And there are many strands to this book that I realized I'd have to train myself to understand before I got any momentum with it at all. Hemingway had a wonderful and storied life in which he experienced incredible things and then got to write about them, but most people don't have that luxury. So I realized I'd have to learn about the Borstal system and life therein. I'd have to learn about pre- and post-war architecture in Britain and elsewhere. I'd have to learn about things like small farm management and soil maintenance and the day-to-day running of an architectural practice, social attitudes in rural Surrey in the 1950s, the entire life and work of Frank Lloyd Wright, the history of and student life at the Liverpool School of Architecture in the 1930s, Depression-era Liverpool. I could speak a bit about contemporary Liverpool, having grown up there, early tractor repair and maintenance, and so on and so on. And it was kind of never-ending. All of my novels, so even A Station on the Path to Somewhere Better, which was actually conceived to be a project that would require much less by way of research, they've all involved extensive research, whether it's book-based research or whether it's kind of field work, just going out to a place and experiencing it. And that's really so that I can give a story as much verisimilitude as I can. So that's in relation to the period it's set in, the place in which it's set, the types of jobs that the protagonist and other characters are engaged in, and so on. So for The Bellwether Revivals, my first book, I had to learn lots of things about psychological disorders, also about music theory, choral music, some pretty niche classical composers, which as a self-taught musician in the Lennon and McCartney kind of grab a second-hand guitar and teach yourself to play school was tough. The Ecliptic involved a lot of dry research into paint making and color theory, as well as walking around an empty Turkish island with a notebook for about a week. And at one point I had to stop for about 2 weeks to read everything I could about the HMS Queen Elizabeth and its voyages from Southampton to New York in the 1960s. But I do that because honestly, the research phase of a novel is usually the most spiriting time, because you can come across a detail, any point of information, something you didn't know within a text that you're reading or in some archive, or maybe you're just wandering around a place you've never been before, and you know that you can take this and fashion it into the fabric of a fictional scene later on, and it'll give you a little tingle of excitement that you can revisit this in a fictional space and make it seem accurate and true. And I've always liked to feed my creativity with facts and then let my imagination project itself into the gaps of what I've learned. Now, when it comes to writing a historical novel, I cleave to the advice I took from Sarah Waters, which is to read enough about the period until you feel you can blag it convincingly, and then you fact-check it all afterwards. And I think this is a solid gold kernel of intel. And I carried it into the early stages of writing The Young Accomplice. I began writing this book in January of 2019, sold it to my editor at Penguin that July. And here's where things began to get more problematic than usual, because it turned out that the pleasant equilibrium of everyone on Earth was about to be disturbed in real life, the irony of which wasn't lost on me at the time. And I think all of us felt the impact of COVID in our own ways, didn't we? Unless you happened to be working in 10 Downing Street at the time, in which case you can probably just leave the room now. Hang your head in shame on the way out. I won't claim that I suffered from its impact any worse than any other person on the planet. I got through it unscathed, you've probably noticed. But I'll say that it definitely generated next to impossible conditions in which to write a novel, let alone a multi-layered historical novel that would depend on a great deal of book-based research and fieldwork. For medical reasons, I was confined to my house for about 18 months with my wife and sons, who were 5 and 2 years old at the time. So yeah, pretty demanding of our attention most of the day. And I was very lucky in that I had a roof over my head and a steady job that I wasn't furloughed from. And I had a room in which to write every day. But all day, every day that I was writing, my boys were growing up in the next room without me. And I was continually aware of how much they needed my presence, how much I needed theirs. The entire world had stalled around them, bewilderingly. It was kind of dying by the hour. And I was sitting at my computer writing a book about silly made-up characters in a silly made-up place in 1952. And I had no rational explanation for them as to why I had to write this book, or what kept me arguing with their mother every day so I could steal a few hours to work on it, or why I had to prioritize reading arcane facts about tractor maintenance ahead of playing with them. And I still don't really have a proper explanation for that. But I will say, honestly, that if I hadn't had The Young Accomplice to work on during that time, I doubt I would have had the wherewithal to actually get through that period. Having this other place to visit every day inside my head, these characters and personalities to occupy and explore, that was the only way I could leave the house. And I'm incredibly grateful for its existence for that reason, even if the readers of the world are apparently less so. What being confined indoors meant was that I wasn't able to do any of the field work I'd planned to do in Liverpool. I couldn't go to, I had grand designs to go out to Wisconsin to see Taliesin and visit the Plaza in New York where Frank Lloyd Wright had worked, etc. And I deliberately set this book in a place that isn't far from where I live in Surrey, so driving distance from where I live, so that I could always just go there, and have a look. But I couldn't really get there more than once in 3 years when I was working on it, so it really could have been set in Gibraltar for all the good it did me. I couldn't even get to the library for the reference books I needed, so it was a bit stifling. And the usual process that I relied on, researching facts ahead of time, knowing enough of the truth that I could safely project the fiction from it, I had to kind of adapt that on the fly and learn a whole new way of writing. And it was a process usually of writing the first few paragraphs of a scene, then pausing, staring at the screen for a long time and thinking, well, I can't really write any more of this until I know some stuff about, let's say, what it was actually like in Borstal in the 1930s and how these offenders were processed on their way or whatever. And it was kind of a constant call and response to that, really. Every character had their own life's details and preoccupations to learn the rudiments of. I recall spending an entire day in lockdown researching the starting mechanism of a 1948 Jaguar Mark 7 saloon on internet forums, finding out, just so I could find out whether or not it required a key to be turned in the ignition, or if you just push the button to get it going, because a lot of those old cars, actually, you just press the starter button. Turns out the internet is an absolute trove of fantastic information about vintage cars, including lots of YouTube videos about, for some reason, a lot of men in Norfolk have filmed themselves starting old cars, just starting them. And for me, I was like, wow, this is everything I need. Thank God for the internet. Yeah, and all of that, it sounds silly, but something like that was actually kind of fundamental to the plot I was building. It was actually it was a very important moment in this book where Joyce has got to start a car. And if I didn't know how the mechanics of that car worked, then I just couldn't write that scene. So it was a big stumbling block. But all of that research felt kind of pointless at the time, and it took place Yeah, while my kids were doing keepy-ups with the balloon in the room next door, pretending to be Diego Maradona. And this isn't the sort of anecdote you come across in the biographies of the literary greats, I know, but it's there anyway. It's all true. So working on this book during COVID, I think, changed the way that I write fiction, and lastingly so. Don't tell my editor. It's true to say that I no longer feel the kind of constant prod upon my shoulder anymore that I used to get on with writing, to be productive with my time away from teaching. I just now write really whenever I can, whenever I'm in the mood, for as long as I want to. And I try very hard not to miss out on seeing my kids grow up or to resent them too much for keeping me from my desk. When I was a freewheeling 20-something, devoid of responsibilities, 1,000 words a day was always the task, the target that I set for myself, and I'd be annoyed with myself if I didn't reach it because, come on, what else did I have to do all day? There was Sky Sports News. But now I'm elated if I can write 250 words in a day, and especially if they're good words. I think experience has taught me that it's better to write nothing at all than 1,000 words I'm embarrassed by the next morning. I think 1 or 2 short bursts of clear-sighted productivity a day is the dragon that I chase now. And I get asked a lot whether I plan my novels in advance, plan out the plot, etc. And the answer is I do, but only up to a point. I think it's important to have an understanding of how the novel will end before I start writing it. So that's not to say that I can envision the precise dimensions of the closing scene, action by action, or conceive every line of dialogue in advance. It's more that I hold some vague perception of the most dramatic moment that the plot is building towards, and how I intend, I think, to leave the reader feeling. It only need be an instinct for a scene, something that's kind of dim or blurry or oblique. But I can't begin without I have that, or the novel will set off in the wrong direction and never recover. And then what I do is I tend to hold the plot and its steps within my head and navigate myself towards it. And if it deviates along the way and goes somewhere more interesting, I just let it go where it needs to go. And if it's gone off somewhere I absolutely didn't want it to, I'll rein it back in and cut it and do other things. So this is the very first thing I wrote of The Young Accomplice, to give you some idea of what I mean. This paragraph didn't end up in the final draft of the story at all, because it changed immeasurably from when I first conceived of it. But it was in the sample chapter that I showed to my editor early on. And I wrote this passage directly onto a typewriter, which is something I tend to do often, especially when I'm trying to start a new scene or a new project in particular. I think I do it so I can pretend I'm as important as Truman Capote, mostly. I think that's honestly true. Anyway, here it is. Down the rutted track, no headlights, crawling in first gear. Past the clutch of alders where the sloe grows underneath the meadow fence. She steers into the dirt lines, curving up towards the house. They are like rails pressed in the mud. The high grass yields under the bumper. The engine ticks and hums. An icy draft swirls through the shattered rear window, biting at her neck. Her brother slumps in the back seat, saying nothing, leaking blood from a straight gash above his eye, so clean and deep the whiteness of his skull is visible each time he removes the sloppy swaddle, asking, "How's it look? How bad is it?" "You live," she wants to say, but doesn't, because the truth is not amenable to platitudes the way her brother is. It won't disappear with prayers and pleasant wishes. The gash will be sewn shut, the car will be repaired, and they will try to carry on as though this never happened. But they won't live again, not really. One day they'll think back on it and know this is the night that killed them. So that didn't at all appear in the book, apart from maybe a couple of descriptive sentences that I pilfered. But it gave me a feeling of where the story was going, the darkest moment of the story, what the relationship was between the two characters and how they were going to operate in the wake of whatever it is that they've been through here. And I cut it. And that's what you should do. I think the best and most rewarding part of writing for me, and most writers here will likely tell you the same thing, is opening the file that you were working on yesterday and seeing a set of paragraphs already written and scenes to tinker with. I don't write full first drafts. Some writers do. You know, they let the whole story spill out and then they go back and revise it and write another whole draft. But I don't really do it that way. Oh, hello. I'm just going to take this as a sign from something. So instead I spend every morning assessing and revising the words I produced the day before until I can read them back without hearing a beat of rhythm out of sync, really, or without, come back, tripping over an ungainly phrasing or something. I look for the bits where I can't cut anything from it that doesn't need to be there. And I think repetition of words is something I tend to... All right.
Really, that's beautiful.
I know, I feel like... Nan, is that you? So yeah, then I start the process of writing new words, picking up the scene or the paragraph where it left off and taking it to its next logical point. But actually, writing the first draft is agony for me, and it's become more and more so. But I do really love the job of tweaking what I've already written. So all of my novels, I would say, are projections from my own experiences. Some of them take more imaginative leaps than others, following the dramatic trajectory that fiction allows, usually to its highest point. Is this the same one? All right. We're good friends now, aren't we? We're going to have to what's your name? What's that? God, it's become children's television all of a sudden. Are you finished? Yeah, in the Bellwether Revivals, my first novel, I projected from my experience of growing up in a nursing home to help shape the protagonist's viewpoint. In The Ecliptic, I projected from memories of doing a lot of collage paintings when I was in art school. A Station on the Path is effectively one exaggerated metaphor for some of the dismal events of my youth. The Young Accomplice builds from my experience of growing up in Merseyside. It actually borrows some of the details of my granddad's life in Bootle. That might be him, actually. He was born in Ireland, so, you know, maybe. But anyway, most of all, it revolves around one character's pursuit of stability and permanence in her life and her younger brother's, which is very much something I think I rendered from a place of personal experience. Joyce Savagir, who's probably the lead character in this book, is a lot like me in the sense that she craves that equilibrium I've been telling you about, because it was taken from her as a girl time and again, and now she can't seem to escape the misfortunes that she's inherited from other people. She's always looking to agitate her own equilibrium as a result, as though some better situation is owed to her or is just edging over the horizon. And I connect with that viewpoint strongly. She was the first character I think I've ever created whose perspective I could comfortably live with writing endlessly. So I'd like to, what time are we at? Finish up with just a little bit from the section of the book that belongs to Joyce. This scene I'm going to read from evokes the moment where the equilibrium that she's managed to carve out for herself after losing her parents in the war is about to ebb away from her even further. And what my hope is that this scene gets across the relativity of goodness as a virtue, which is what I wanted this novel to be about from the start. Because I'd like to think that the reader can feel some warmth and empathy for Joyce's character in this scene, despite the fact that she's about to choose a life of thieving and dishonesty. So yeah, here it is. This comes from somewhere in the middle. Okay, there might be time for some questions afterwards. I'll do my best. They'd met when she was 16 on a dreary afternoon in Maidstone, middle of the week. She'd been on lunch break, smoking round the back of E.H. Lacey's store, and he'd been sitting in a Daimler parked up in the alley, blocking the goods entrance with his bonnet. Her first thought had been, fancy motor, must be rich, this fella. She hadn't given much consideration to the way he looked, all slouched and rumpled-shirted, messing with the dial on the radio. There'd been muffled squeals as he'd gone searching for the frequency he wanted. Then a crackly commentator's voice had risen from the fuzz, and he'd turned up the volume. The tail end of a horse race had played out. She'd watched his growing pleasure as the commentary got louder and more frantic, and eventually he'd drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and whooped, pumping his fists. Their eyes had hooked together for a moment through the glass. No boy had ever ogled her the way Mal did, as though he'd noticed some rare object on a rag-and-bone man's cart and wanted to possess it. At school, they'd called her names like lumberjack and elephant, but there he'd been, this grown man in his Daimler, giving her the up and down. She'd felt a hum go through her, like that time she'd touched the frayed wire of her auntie's hairdryer. Maybe if she hadn't smiled back at him, he would have left her well alone. Instead, he'd leaned across to scroll the window down. "Oi there, listen, what's your name?" he'd called. "You fancy going for a ride somewhere? I just got 10 quid richer and I want to spend it all before the sun goes down. You interested?" "Sorry, can't," she said. "My shift's not done till 6. You can always find another place to work. There's plenty more shops in the city." He'd scratched his beard. "Or, better yet, give up the working life forever. It does wonders for the soul, believe me." "Nah," she'd said. "I've rent to pay. Thanks for the offer, though." "Well, maybe next time. Seems I know your place of work, so I can come and find you when I'm in the mood." "You can try." She'd given him a nervous laugh. "I will." He'd rolled the window up again and leaned away. By the time they'd finished talking, there was ash all down the front of her best blouse. Her sandwiches were still inside her bag. A little disappointment had begun to stab at her. 4 more hours of drudgery indoors were her reward for being good. Was this how it was going to be forever? Wrapping things for customers in women's wear, no conversation, polishing the counters so her face reflected in the brass, and sweeping floors at closing time until the boss said she could leave. How much worse off would she be if she went driving with a stranger for a while? It didn't seem that she'd be losing anything. But she hadn't got a chance to change her mind because the Daimler's engine wouldn't go when Mal had tried to fire it up again. She'd listened to the scratch and wheeze each time he pressed the starter. Eventually he'd given up and stepped into the alley. "What's the matter with your motor?" she'd said as he'd walked back around the back end, looking sheepish. It was rare to find a man so tall she couldn't see the top part of his scalp from yards away. "Gone and drained the battery, I think," he'd said. "Ah, well, it was a nice one too." For a second, she'd been puzzled, wondering what made one battery any nicer than another. Then she'd watched him open up the boot. He tossed the key with its big leather fob inside and slammed the lid. Turning slowly, he'd approached her. His enormous rubber soles had made no sound at all. He'd held his finger to his lips and shushed. "I never got your name, but that's all right. I trust you." With a wink, he'd backed away and strolled along the alley. No young girl would ever look upon Mal Duggan as a picture worthy of a frame, but his appeal was in his attitude to life. He seemed to drift along without the worries that tied other people down and buried them. One day's graft after the next was not Mal's style. He was spontaneous, which made him unpredictable and dizzying. His confidence was like a tonic she'd been given to forget the fears that were ingrained in her, all those notions that she'd wind up miserable, a failure, on her own for good. So what if there was menace in him too? A little danger meant excitement, didn't it? And if she'd wanted boredom, she'd have stayed in school and lived the drab existence that her auntie wanted her to have in Borough Green, church on Sundays, married off to some God-fearing member of the congregation no one else would have, ironing his smalls throughout the week and cooking him 2 different kinds of gravy for his roast. No thank you. I'll leave it there, okay? Thank you all.
We have a little bit of time for
If we
questions.
have a little bit of time, great.
Will we ask the butterfly?
Yeah, maybe the butterfly.
Raise your hands, maybe 3 or 4 questions. So put your hands up and I'll bring the mic over to you.
Butterfly.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, you said earlier about knowing the end before you start. Are there any rules you apply to a situation where you start at the end and then fill it in from there, whether that's going to work or not?
Yeah, you never quite know whether it's going to work or not. But I mean, my first book I wrote in the kind of Sunset Boulevard, you know, there's a body floating face down, da-da-da. And then you start again from the preceding moments and you understand why the body's there. It's a kind of classic narrative device, which I think I did because I wanted it to be published. And I didn't want them all to go, well, nothing seems to happen in this book for at least 40 pages. You know? And if I had my time again, I would not have written it that way. But anyway. But this book, I always try and begin a story with something already in motion. And usually it's I start as close to the most dramatic moment as I possibly can. And this book in particular, the way that it's structured, not that any reader needs to know this or will notice it, is it has a kind of nested structure, I think of it. So each chapter begins in a kind of present moment, and then folded into it is the deeper backstory which explains the moment that they're in. And more or less each chapter has that structure to it. And what that does is it allows you to be running two timelines at once without the reader necessarily, without the reader necessarily understanding. So that it feels like even in the moments where you're being told stuff that is backstory, it feels connected to the story that's moving forward. So I was always taught when I was learning writing, when I did a master's in Canada with a very, what's the word for Keith? He was a professor of creative writing who was largely ambivalent to everyone's writing, but he would sit there for the entire hour of the class saying nothing, and then he'd stand up and say one thing about the piece of work. And the thing that he used to say to me is always keep the story moving forward. Always keep it moving forward. So don't linger too long in stuff which doesn't pertain to the moment that you have the character in. So I always have a feeling of, like that opening bit I read, which didn't end up in the book, I knew that the characters were coming to a point where one of them's going to cause a problem that both of them are therefore going to become embroiled in. And they're going to have to either flee or do something about their situation. And whatever has happened to them is going to ruin the happiness that they think they've got. And that's what I mean by knowing what the ending is. I didn't know exactly what that looked like, and I was happy to write it a certain way and then change it as I actually built the characters and realized I can't have that scene anymore because it doesn't make any sense. So it's just a vague feeling of knowing how you're going to disrupt the settled state of the story and then building towards that. And there are many different ways that you can write that. You can start with it and fold it back. You can tell the whole story backwards. You can do all kinds of form-bending things if you want. But I tend to be quite a linear writer. And as you've noticed, I like to linger quite a bit in detail, which seems unnecessary. But it isn't. Thank you for your question.
Juan, anybody else? One more? Oh, Grace. Anyway, we'll just pass the microphone down this room. We'll do this last question, and then Ben will go upstairs and sign, so you can probably ask him further questions.
Of course.
Do you, when you're writing, do you do like a storyboard? So like you have chapter 1, this is going to happen, or chapter 2?
I don't storyboard chapter by chapter, but I'm a big believer in having a 3-act structure to what I write. Not everyone does. But I find it really helpful at the beginning to create like a narrative arc. There's sort of, I teach this, so I have to practice what I preach. So a beginning, a middle, and an end. What the the first act climax is, the second act climax, and what the arc of the story is. And I always at the beginning sort of try and build an arc of that. Certainly with my first book, then my second and my third, I did that. This one I did less of that, and the one I'm writing now, I'm not doing any of it because I've got, I think, better at just doing that process in my head. But I always like to know as much as possible, what's going to happen at the end of the, like, if it's a 300-page novel, 100 pages in, something has to have either happened or be very close to happening in terms of like something that's going to disrupt everything that these characters have built for themselves. But I found it less and less. Oh no, maybe not. What I do is I will do stuff like that which plans it out, and then I'll only keep it in a notebook which I then won't look at again throughout the course of writing it. But having done it is important to straighten out my thoughts before I then. So it's always useful to do something like that, even if you don't actually have it on your wall at home and refer to it all the time.
Thank you.
Right? Thank you all for coming, and to the butterfly.